Hello. Well, wow. Our clock is off up there. We're gonna have to check that out. So I got 5:56, but that's okay. Doesn't matter. We're live, so I guess we start. If you're joining us for a Bible study, welcome. We're going to be in Genesis. We're going to start with looking at after the dream and as Joseph begins to rule. So we're going to jump a little bit, but we're going to go all the way from chapter 41. We're going to jump all the way up to 47 to bring these ideas together because it does tell the story through. So we're going to do a little review because I wasn't here last week, and then we'll look at some aspects of the way that the management and the way that the famine happens and all that goes on. What starts all this is we know that, one, he was a slave boy, and that as he comes through the house of Potiphar, goes to prison, then we know he interprets a dream of a cupbearer and a baker, and those dreams, then the baker he's executed by the Pharaoh, and the cupbearer is restored into his position. And that dream, he always, one of the things is saying to them, everybody, is that this is not my interpretation, this is something that God has given me the ability. He asked the cupbearer to please don't forget me. And that's exactly what he does. He forgets him, and we know that a whole 2 years go by before he is remembered. And the only reason that he's remembered is because Pharaoh has a dream, and he has a dream of 7 cows that are healthy that come up out of the river Nile, and then 7 gauntly cows come up out of the river, and they eat the good cows, and he wakes up. He has another dream, and in that it's wheat, 7 heads of very healthy, 7 that are very sickly, and the sickly ones overcome the healthy ones, and he awakes. So 2 dreams, one representing the animals, the cattle, Nile, life, that's about all, and then wheat, all this is around a lot of the foundational things of a nation that keep it healthy and surviving. If you're a leader, one aspect you would think of that a lot would not possibly, that would be, what is this going to do to my rule as a Pharaoh? But he doesn't understand it, and he's discussing it, and then lo and behold, the cupbearer, he's like, okay, I know somebody. I remember this guy. So he brings him out, and he brings him up, shaves him, cleans him, brings him before the Pharaoh. And the same process. I mean, he says, I will give you one that God will give you favorably. It's not, I'm going to give you a message you're going to like, but in other words, I'm going to give you a correct interpretation. And then he does. And he tells him that this dream is something that is coming up, something that's going to happen, and that the dream is something that God is revealing to him about the future. So it's not just some random, it's not from an Egyptian god. This is something coming from them. Hello, Cindy and Haynes. Glad you joined us. And if you're out there and you haven't responded or done something and you want to interact, you want to add to the class, please put in the comments. They pop up, I get to see them, and I will catch them and we'll share them. So don't hesitate. We'll get to them. So the Pharaoh is told that the dreams, though they're 2, they're one meaning. And that the reason there's 2 is it doubles it is because it helps to show that God has fixed this dream as something that's real. But it's still the same message. If you'll notice, the commonality of them is something very healthy is consumed by something unhealthy, something sickly. And they're both aspects that are going to be impacted by what it is. So he tells him that you're going to have 7 years where you're going to have an abundance. And then you're going to have 7 years of a famine. And it's going to hit. And then he gives him the advice and says, you need to choose, you need to collect a portion of the abundance during the time of abundance. And he tells him basically 20%, 1/5. 20% of your abundance. Keep that in mind when we go and talk later about the actual management and what happens, because it's interesting. But it's their grain, but he wants to collect the excess and storage. So he tells him, you need to find somebody. And of course, he already knows his man. He says, okay, where am I going to find somebody like this? Where could we find somebody with the Spirit of God? And this is the Spirit of God, not of one of their Pharaoh gods, but of Yahweh God. Well, he's the only one. And he automatically elevates him. So we have him going from age 17 to the age of 30, going from all the bondage, the dungeon, the prison, all the way now. He's second in rule. And there's nobody next to Pharaoh, which is a very vulnerable position for the Pharaoh to just place somebody that's been brought out of prison. Well, you think about this. I mean, it's kind of like you're taking somebody straight out of prison and you're giving him total control over the nation, like that. No background check, just like that. I think God probably had a little to help providentially, to help Pharaoh go ahead and make that decision that he's going to use Joseph in this. But this is complete power. And he changes his name. And this is where, by this time, Joseph is looking more Egyptian than he is a Hebrew. But the Pharaoh knows he's Hebrew. And that is where we kind of discuss timing. I want to deviate too much off on what Pharaoh this is, whether it's the Hyksos pharaohs, which were Asiatic, they weren't Egyptian, or were they the Egyptian? Because there was a time period around 1800 BC where the lower part of Egypt was invaded and overrun by Canaanites, Asiatics, they call them the Hyksos pharaohs. And they have actually looked at DNA and they've tracked them, and they are not Egyptian. And they ruled for a time period, and then they were overthrown. And they go back to just pure. But the land was divided to upper and lower Egypt. And so I just feel like that this is a pure Egyptian. Pharaoh, he's not one of these other ones, because we pointed out the fact that, first off, when he brought him out, he shaved him and cleaned him. And it was very offensive for the Egyptians to have body hair. So they would have done that for him. For the Hyksos pharaohs, they didn't care. Facial hair, they didn't at all. But as far as the other aspect was when it came to marrying and giving him a wife from a priest, daughter of an Egyptian god. He's not, this is something that, they respected the gods of the Hyksos, but they still worship Canaanite gods. And this is a priest of an Egyptian god that he is giving the daughter to him. And so the last part of there on 45, we see that Joseph went out over the land, which means he traveled. He went out and he looked and saw everything that was out there and he's going to be in charge of it. And so he goes out and looks. And this is where I brought up this aspect that I want to keep that kind of dangling in your mind, is why did he not go home? There's just that hanging thought that now, he's always said when he was in prison, tell the Pharaoh I'm here, I'm a Hebrew, I'm here unfairly, get me out of here. And we automatically think, get me out of here so I can go home. Now he's out. And we see that last verse there, Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Well, why didn't he just journey on? Go on home. And I think I want that to dangle as a thought as we go through. And I think there's some cues that we can see. All the way through, though, it plays out. We'll discuss it some more. We know exactly 30 years old when he came into the service. So that's how we can kind of date how long. We know he was 17 when we met him in the introduction of the story between Joseph. As far as was he exactly 17 when he was taken as a slave? Don't know. But he sure was in his teens, probably 17, 18 or so, when this did happen. And that's a pretty powerful position. I thought it was also interesting, the age, even among the Hebrews. In order to be respected as a man, to be a rabbi, you got to be 30. So I don't know if that's the same way. The other aspect about the Hebrew, and the Hebrews are shepherds. They are herders, and that was something to the Egyptians that was very despicable. And I've always kind of hung on why. Why would this be something? Well, the Hyksos pharaohs come from herders and shepherds, and they had goats and sheep, and they were, so I think every aspect, that's one of the things they find archaeologically is how clean that they removed those Hyksos pharaohs. They tried to chisel them out of everything and remove and clean themselves from the history of this time period that's punctuated by these foreigners who came in and started ruling half their land. But we see that it's a problem. That's why I said later on we'll see whenever Jacob brings a family, Joseph brings up the fact that that's a problem. So we need to put my family somewhere else because being a shepherd is offensive to the Egyptians. So that's something that it wasn't offensive to the Hyksos pharaohs. Another reason. But so now we're going to go ahead and we're going to start in our text this evening in chapter 41 in verse 47 and start getting right into the actual execution of the plan that he's going to do. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of these 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and he put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in a great abundance, and the sand of the sea, like the sand of the sea, until it ceased to measure it, for it measured. This is more, so when we talk about the percentage, 20% above, so if they had a normal crop, that 20% would be an impact. Another thing to kind of keep in mind is, because like I said, we're looking at the leadership and the management of this famine period. I'm going to skip the brothers and the family. I'm going to look at this. We're going to jump to 47. But looking at this aspect of how he carries this out and what he does, that 20% is above is with the abundance period. So if it was a normal year, 20% would have hurt them. At this time, everybody owns their own land. Everybody owns their own livestock. And I guess you'll call it the Pharaoh, house of Pharaoh, was not as financially strong as people think. When we think of a king, we automatically think of somebody who dominates and has all the money. Where do they get their money from? The people. But when we look at the way this is managed, you find something unique in what he does when it comes to collecting back. And what he sets up is something that radically changed the government for the house of Pharaoh. That from that day forward, and there's actually some, one of the pharaohs that they believe was at that time, had a huge reorganization of his government, where he set up a government. They don't say it's Joseph because, it's secular history. They can't say, oh, that was that Bible character. But they very clearly say the Pharaoh set up a department of kind of like agriculture, and then that started collecting and doing all these things. And they have very specific events of this really reorganization of the Pharaoh's government, which coincides with the policies and things that we see that Joseph brings in and he sets up. The other thing is they have found these grain storage bins that are massive silos, but they were in the ground versus like the silos you would see in Kansas or around places where they have wheat that are just massive, 20 stories high, some of them with wheat, but these were under the ground, several of these large ones like the one I have there. And then it was set up in a way that was very fascinating on how it was almost like a Walmart, the way you'd come in, the way they set this up. And if you look at these columns here, it's kind of hard. I couldn't find the other picture, but if you're looking down this, what you're looking at is these columns, but in between each column, there's like a booth on the left and the right. And people would be sitting there behind a table. And there was a one-way flow that people would come into this structure and exchange money, get a receipt, continue down to the end of that hall, go down those flight of stairs, and then they would receive bags of grain because the grain would come down through this structure. And then they'd take their bag and they'd go out the bottom. So they kind of had a circle way that they'd flow through, and they found it. Now, we don't see that in the Bible. It doesn't say that he built something, but it's kind of like one of those necessary logical conclusions that if all of a sudden he is gathering and collecting this type of grain in such a large abundance, where are you going to put it? It's something you don't normally do, and you know you're going to have to redistribute it. But it's amazing that they just didn't put it off somewhere. They had an organization to even how they were going to then redistribute it. And so people would come to this facility. I had some other pictures as well of it, where people would line up, and I could just see all these caravans coming down to Egypt, lining up and going through, paying that, and then they would walk downstairs, and then they had bags. They would sit and fill these bags up, and then here you go. Here's a receipt for how many bags of grain, and go on out. So I think that is pretty powerful when you look at it. I think it's great when we can look at archaeological things like this and see the supporting of this. But what wisdom, again, that we're looking at. Now, we have this verse right here that's kind of, it's important. And we see that just the year before the famine came. So how many years are we in? 6 years into the famine. So 1 year before, he has 2 sons. And when we think of this, if you look at the timing of having children, it's always not convenient, is it? You never really get a choice too much. I may be overplaying this, but if he would have just started ruling, got married, and then had children, and he's trying to set all this up, but 6 years is a good period where you're like, okay, we got things going, we've been collecting the abundance and everything, and then he has the children. 6 years into marriage. That's pretty interesting. 6, too. And so he has these 2 children, but let's look at what he names them in verse 52. He called the firstborn Manasseh. Sound familiar? Yeah, that's a big name. We know that's one of the 12, right? But look what the name means. God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. Wow. And then Ephraim, from God, he has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. So what's his state of mind about his family? Can we start to see something about what's...
He doesn't need to go back. This is his life now.
I think it reflects what he's resolved to. You know, it's like Jacob even went home. I mean, there's something that's happened that he is, like I said, when he went and traveled the land, why did he not go home? And then when we see the way he's going to interact with his brothers, there's a little bit where I think that he has resolved himself that he's not a part of the family. That,
He accepted it.
I mean, look what he's saying. I got this kid because God is helping me to forget all the hardship and my father's house. To forget my father's house. And forget the suffering that I experienced up to this point. 2 things he wants. He says, this child has done for me, has fulfilled me, and helped to replace the memory of my father's house and the memory of what put me in here, which was what? My father's house, my brothers. And then the second one, not only, and this is, God has made me fruitful in this land of what? My affliction. The land where I have suffered, God has blessed me. Which is great tribute to God. You know that it's God here, he gives credit to. Both those names have something very positive about God. God has helped me forget. God has made me fruitful. So there's a couple of things we see just in the names of being helpful. And Manasseh is going to be one of the larger tribes, and Ephraim are very important. Later on, we'll see when you get into the history of the tribes as they go on. And then, so in the middle of this, 1 year before the famine starts, then we're told about him having these children. And then we move back in verse 53. The 7 years of plenty occurred in the land and came to an end. And the 7 years of famine began to come. As Joseph had said, there was famine in all the lands, but in the land of Egypt there was bread. So right away, how would you feel if you were the Pharaoh? I made a good call on him, didn't I? I mean, for a moment, just think if you were Pharaoh and you just put a Hebrew prisoner in charge of the nation, you don't think there's some jealousy? Somebody in the wings sitting there going, I'm more deserving than him. Look how loyal I've been to you. You know, I've gone to battle for you. I've been serving you. I'm Egyptian. And you just chose a Hebrew, a herder, to come in because he interpreted your dreams. You don't even know this God. We don't respect that God. Our God are Egyptian gods. But you have a dream and you get a Hebrew out of the prison and he comes up and he says, my God Yahweh can tell you the dream. He gives you an interpretation and man, you're just hook, line, and sinker. Who's getting hooked on this here? So you can see where there would be some, they're not going to say it to his face, right? Because he's Pharaoh. I mean, but, and another interesting thing is there's an aspect of who is Pharaoh here. And again, there's some tweaking on some of these years on names, but one of them, or two of them that they believe are pretty sure that were ruling, actually co-ruled. A father and a son. And so there's an interesting aspect there that if it was them, even though we're getting singular, it does not mean that the scripture's wrong. They both are pharaohs. But one of them, is the one that we see engaged. So they're delegating. They've given it away. So it's very troublesome. So whenever all of a sudden, you see the plan being enacted, the Hebrew is managing everything, and you're sitting there going, oh, I hope this works, okay, good. Yeah, everything seems to be going well. And then all of a sudden you got this abundance. Okay, yeah, that's happening. We got lots of grain. And then all of a sudden the famine hits. And as a leader, you're sitting there going, good and bad. Bad because look what it's done environmentally. Look what's going on. And do we have enough? Are we going to have enough? We have bread today in the first year of the famine, but are we going to have enough to go all the way through? 7 years. But so far, everything that God has said has come true. So it's also a testimony of the truthness of God, the truthness of Joseph as well. But you see that Egypt is the only place that's got the bread, has food. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph. What he says to you, you do. That, you're turning it again, you're saying, go to the foreigner. He's that guy that's been running around you've been grumbling about. He's managing this problem. I'm going to let him continue to do this. So, for 7 years, the Pharaoh collected 20% of this abundance. And a part of that now has given him power, you would think, and this starts to build up where we start to look at when they come back. The famine continues, and we have this pause, and that's why I wanted to jump all the way over. We're going to jump all the way to 47. We're not going to discuss, the brothers coming and reconciliation. We're going to just look at this aspect of it because I think it helps to explain. Because if you just go through and go from this famine scriptures here and you jump over after you go through all the brothers and reconciliation and Benjamin and all of that, and then you get to 47 and it tells you, and the famine continued, and then you get into these policies things that we're going to read, you go, what? So that's why I'm kind of going to skip that and tie these two together because you see what's going on. So they collected that 20%, and now whatever the people had is exhausted. Now, let's talk about a famine. Now, if I said a famine, what would you think? What is causing the famine? What would you think initially is the cause of a famine? That,
Even agriculture is a drought.
that's what, yeah.
Even animals. Animals can't eat. There's no rain or grain, grass.
I know modern day in the world, that's what it is, isn't it? That's really the main source of a drought. This is believed by archaeologists, and they've actually got watermarks and stuff, and they've measured it and date and time stuff. It wasn't a drought of water, a lack of water. It was too much water. It flooded their fields and killed all the crops. They couldn't plant. And it overwhelmed all the farmland. Think about it. They didn't have flood control. Like I don't know why we do it now, but we have actually a levee around our river. And back in the 30s, that river would come all the way across near the railroad tracks. There used to be a bridge. I don't know if you remember, Gary, but it went over the railroad tracks, over the flood area, down Johnson's hardware store. I mean, the river, when we got in the flood stage, the river would just come out and just spread out. And so in modern times, what do? We build levees, and we can control that flood. Well, they didn't do that. They needed that moisture. But when you get too much, then it could destroy the crops if they're underwater. Matter of fact, our alfalfa, when they cut our alfalfa in our monsoon period and getting the chili out of the ground, and pecans even, we have struggles with that because we get hardly no rain at all. But when it's harvest time, we seem to have our monsoons, and then they can't get in and get the pecans off, and they're sitting in the water. So that was fascinating because I've always thought it had to be a lack of water. But in this situation, and what some have said, because now not everybody's growing their stuff on the river. I mean, because everybody's lacking bread, so those in Canaan as well. But it could be the same thing. You also have, like here in Las Cruces, we're getting a lot of water in Elephant Butte and areas because of the huge amount of snowpack. And now it's coming down. But you just go 30, 50 miles down somewhere, they got no water. Texas right now, west, they're drought. They're in a stage 3 drought. Their lakes, when I was down there last week, it's horrible. Our lake is up 35, 40%. So even though you try to say, well, not everybody had their crops flooded, it could still be both. Because where the source of the Nile is and the excess water. But if we disagree, that's fine. I just thought I'd throw that out there because they do have watermarks where they can time it, and they have this huge flooding period of years where this water was just flooding. But the point is, they cannot grow crops. And it's not like today where we can fly tons of grain to different areas. So they're coming to Pharaoh now. They know he's got this abundance. This is not a normal procedure. This is the first time that they've had 6 years where they've gotten used to them coming and taking my 20%. But they don't necessarily know, the average guy, but they know that he's got a bunch of grain now, and they have to go to the Pharaoh to get it, and he directs them to Joseph. Joseph, this is where we're going to talk about one of those aspects of his interaction with the people and what he could have done and he didn't do. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to him, and they come to him, starving to death. So let's jump to chapter 47. And this, now in 47, that's why I said it's quite a jump when you go there. Verse 13. Because this is it's kind of like a bookshelf story, book endings. You have one end where we have the famine start, and then we have the family story. And then it comes back, wraps back around, and talks about the flood again. I'm not going to, there's just too many scripture. So I'm going to read it and just read 13 through 26. Now there was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished by reason of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they bought. And Joseph brought the money into the Pharaoh's house. And when the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, and all the Egyptians came to Joseph and they said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone." And Joseph answered, "Give your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock if your money's gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses and the flocks and the herds and the donkeys. He supplied them with food in exchange for all the livestock that they had that year. And when the year was ended, and they came to him the following year, and they said to him, "We will not hide from the Lord that all our money is spent. The herds of our livestock are the Lord's. There is nothing left in sight of the Lord but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and with our land we will be the servants to Pharaoh. And give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, and for the Egyptians sold their fields, because the famine was severe on them, and the land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made servants of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, "Behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed, you shall sow the land. And at the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, as food for yourselves and for your household, and as food for your little ones." And they said, "You have saved our lives. May it please the Lord, we will be servants to the Pharaoh." So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day that Pharaoh should receive the fifth of the land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's. So, there's a couple of thoughts. This is a struggle. And I'm going to start with this idea. Presidents issue executive orders, which is, they can just say something and they can do it. And one of the greatest one, since he's dead, but a lot of those executive orders in the past, at least 5 presidents, people tended to love them if they liked that president. If they didn't like that president, they detested those executive orders. Both ways. And very polarized. And depending on how you looked at it, you thought it was just or it was unjust. And I'm saying this because when we look at this, it sounds like communism. Sounds like he's setting up a feudal system. And it depends on, again, kind of the direction you look at this. So there's a couple of ideas, when we look at this. Is Joseph being more of a dictator and directing them? Or is he a deliverer? And because some of this looks like, is he taking advantage? There's some people who pose the argument that Joseph here, and I'm going to give kind of both, is that he's taking advantage. I mean, where did they get that grain for Pharaoh to begin with? He got it from the people, kind of a tax. And now he's going to turn around and sell it back to them? It doesn't seem fair, And then they run out of money, and he takes advantage of them. I mean, he says, "Okay, fine, then you know what? Give me all your livestock." And so the Pharaoh takes all the livestock. Now he's got all their money, and he's got all their livestock, and then they come back and they go, "Okay, we got nothing left, so okay, become a servitude to the Pharaoh, and we'll take your land. We'll buy your land for food." Sounds like you got them over the barrel. What option do they got? Why don't you just give it back to them? Is that kind of a valid thing you're thinking? I mean, come on, some people are, you have to kind of look at it that way and go, why doesn't Joseph just go, oh, wow, you're right. There was nothing about it when he had that dream that he told Pharaoh, and we're going to be generous and just give this stuff out so people don't starve. But don't you think that? Benevolence? Why aren't they being benevolent and just giving the food back? Helping them out so the poor people don't starve. They're giving up all their animals. You took all their money. You took their land now, and now you've enslaved them.
Maybe it was a payback time because he had been going through a lot in Egypt. They never liked him. They never, they've been dealing with him all along. So it's payback time. I don't know.
This is a reflection as well as a very interesting relationship that the pharaohs up to this point had with the people. That didn't exist. You notice one of the last statements is, Joseph made this a statute. And the pharaohs many times, their house alone would suffer because they had no land. They were very dependent upon almost generous donations or getting it. There was nothing organized or steady like a very structured feudal system like we would think of in the Middle Ages. The pharaohs, yes, they're Pharaoh and they're a god and they needed to donate. They received, it was different. It's not what we think. Now we see it's shifting. There's also a part of this is you can't inject the idea that everything about what Joseph is going to do is going to be completely godly either. It's going to be sinful, and it's not going to necessarily make sense to us. But if you're looking at it from one point of view, you could say, there's communism, man, right there. That's the way we should run our governments. I mean, come on. Joseph established. I mean, look at it. Isn't that equity? Taking the wealth of a nation and redistributing it and then collecting it back? So there's a good argument with that. I don't agree. I think that it has to do with this is almost a political thing. You don't get something for free.
That's what I was going to say. He's a good businessman.
And it is, but it's not. I mean, yes, it's good business. But there's something more spiritual than just good business. It's good moral business. Because you just give stuff away, then people don't appreciate it. They don't understand it. There's a level of this where God is going to provide for them. And if you'll notice, one thing to remember, they came to Pharaoh. They made the suggestions. He didn't say, I will take you as slaves and I will take your land and then we'll feed you. The people suggested that.
But also after the famine, then what happens? But you did this before. Let's just keep continuing like this. You just keep giving me freebies. It never ends.
Well, and it also, think about it, if they continue to collect, what if they have another famine? What if they have another bad year? Now that Pharaoh, there's a reserve, kind of like we have an oil reserve, I think. But, America has massive oil reserves, and we file it off at times, and we will pump it out during different, it's supposed to be for national emergencies, but they pull off so much, and they pump it out into tanks for emergencies. And so from that day forward, this 20% now is going to be there. So now you talk about a flood comes, drought comes, pestilence comes. They've got it. It's there. They can access it. In a way, he's giving the land back to them, isn't he? Because they said, we'll give you the land, you feed us. Give us some seed, though, so we can still farm. And he said, okay, well, I'll go with that. You give me the land, and I'll give you the seed. And then he turns around and says, but keep 80% of it. And use the seed to replant And also feed your family. You get 80% of it back. I'm going to feed you during this, and you're going to get 80% back, and I'm going to take 20%, and you can take the seed and everything we're giving you. Now, as far as the animals, there's also an aspect of this. That's their tractors. So, and there's a part of a lot of that Pharaoh doesn't need. All of a sudden, he's going to have a stockyard to bring all these animals, and so that creates a little bit of an issue. You take it from all the land of Egypt. What do you do with all the animals in Egypt? Does it make sense? I mean, but what do you do during a famine with your animals? How much does it take to feed them and care for them? Are you going to give the grain to the cow or your family? What's going to happen to these animals during a famine? They die. So there's a part that he's delivering them away and bringing and actually taking the livestock off their hands and relieving them and saving the livestock, because now the Pharaoh can feed them and care for them, and they're not going to go out there and die. Because if you got a choice between your wife and a cow and your baby and a cow, you're going to feed your family, the animal's going to die. So by the Pharaoh bringing the animals, and again, this is their suggestion. This was not something that they brought up. The other thing is, with power, I want to look at this part of his character, because we know that, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? And it's very hard not to be influenced by that. And to watch this interaction, these conversations he's having with the people are very respectful. There's nothing about him talking down to them and the way they're coming. He's cooperating with them. They're buying it from him at a fair market. He's not taking advantage of them with illegal scales, as we would say, and when they run out of money, they've run out of money. And so they come and they offer, buy our livestock, and he does. All of this is they're coming to him and asking for this to be done that way, and he agrees to it. And the fact that he still is being gracious enough to say, take the seed and take the land back, and he could have said, but give 50% to Pharaoh's house. He could have said 70%, couldn't he have? Remember at the beginning when he had the dream, he instructed Pharaoh to take 1/5 of the abundance. That's all. That's 20%. Today we pay more than 20% taxes in America. So if you're paying 20%, you got a good tax person. Because if you look at all the taxes we pay, the average American's paying 45% taxes. And I'm talking about not just your income tax, but your different licensing and different things that we're paying to our government to get services. We pay a lot for that. So 20% even in this time, historians have said it's not bad. Most of the dictators would have said, I want half. I want half. Another interesting aspect here is the priest. There's a little, I wonder, about a foreshadowing of the Levites, because the Levites as well do not have land. They're taken care of by the cities. They're exempt. And it's kind of interesting how that Pharaoh is doing this for the priest of On as well. Cindy, she says, I thought having a reserve was brilliant for future famines for the people and the livestock. Absolutely, yeah. That's what I mean about when I read a lot of the things and different controversy around this process and the way that this comes out, the way Joseph. Now, Joseph is coming up with this. You remember, it said, you go talk to Joseph. Hands off. So I don't see Joseph saying, okay, I'll get back to you, but I got to go talk to the Pharaoh. And then I'll come back and I'll let you know. It seems he's the one making these decisions. I do believe that this is something that providentially God is taking care of the people. He's taking care of all of them as well. But he's also structuring Egypt and the government of Egypt in a very healthy way by establishing, managing their resources, and then being able to turn around and take care of the people. And if they're good pharaohs, they're going to be able to help prosper and guide that nation. And a lot of times we kind of overlook that in this big story, what's it all about? If we look at the big story, it's about God fulfilling a prophecy to Abraham about not only the people, but his people were going to be in a foreign land for 400 years. And in that 400 years, then they would come out and go to the Canaan. So in that, what I'm saying is, God is fulfilling a promise, and yet we see all people receiving some blessings from it. And a testimony, because you're seeing what Joseph's able to accomplish. So that's why I think the big lesson here we see is everyone's a recipient of God's blessings, one way or another. Everyone. Whether you realize it or not. You know, this nation, whether you like it or not, if you're an atheist, agnostic, whatever. America was built upon moral values that come from God. Period. Not from devil, not from Baal, not from the Egyptian gods, but from God. And that, building a nation upon God's moral values, has allowed this nation to prosper in ways that no other civilization has ever been able to do. And advance in our technology and our influence and democracy and freedoms and things like that. So even those who still hate God, who live in this nation, they're blessed. We say that a lot when we say, you have the right to talk any way you want. You know, that's freedom of speech. And people could say, I disagree, I hate that, not in these old nations, no. You don't see that. And I think of Matthew chapter 5:45, the second part of that, when Jesus says, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and the good, and he sends the rain on the just and on the unjust. God just fulfilling his promise to his people, everyone ends up being blessed. Whether you're going to believe it or not, you know, the world is a better place that came into the influence of God's people. I think that's kind of my roll-up. And the biggest one of all is all this is happening in God's time, not ours. So any wrap-up comments, thoughts?
I'm kind of confused why, how can they grow the seed they were taking back? Because you said it wasn't drought, but it was water everywhere, like flooding. So if they take part of the seed, where will they plant it?
Well, you know what, that's a good point, because I thought of that too, was, okay, if this is in year 2 of the drought and they come back, it doesn't do me any good to have a pile of seed, whether it's lack of water or too much, right? We still got 6 more years or 5 more years. It's still not going to help. So if you look at the progression, I think if you look at year by year, these are years, because as he goes through, you know, he talks about first the money after he had purchased, and there's this exchange of grain and stuff going on for a year or so, and it gets to the point where the people are out of money, and then they come and they make that, and then another year, and they reach a point. So I think this is an explanation over the extended period of this, but the last one is finally probably close to the last of the drought, but maybe like year 6, and so he's going to feed them, and he's going to give them the seed, and they're going to make it through this year, and then you've got seed when it's able, and when it starts producing, here's the seed. Because it's kind of, he's going to give them seed and kind of give them their land back, but the land's not really useful, the seed's not really useful, but you're going to get to eat. But when you can, and the land is good, and the seed will work, here we go. So, but that is interesting. If you think you're still in year 3, that's a worthless deal, because I'm going to have to come back in a year and I still got no land, but thanks for the seed. It's just sitting over here. But you look at year as they go through, this is probably year 6, where they're toward the end of the famine, when they finally come and make the deal with indentured servitude. And it's not the same indentured servitude that we think of. It's kind of an employment. A good example, we always joke around about it. You go to a restaurant, and you'll say, "Oh man, I forgot my wallet," and they say, "That's okay, you can wash dishes." We joke around, but that is indentured. In other words, I'm indentured because I owe you something, and so I'm going to work. And I thought about that, and I've really been listening to a lot of podcasts around Westerns and Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett and all these the Wild West times out here. And a lot of those guys, that's what they did. They would travel from one ranch to another and indenture themselves to that rancher. They would say, "I will serve you and work your cattle, you feed me." And we'd say, is that slavery? No. But you're, in a sense, in a relationship that's unique. It's saying, "I will give you my work and I will stay with you as long as you feed me." And in this sense, it's the same way. We'll work for you. You provide us the food. We'll give you. It's a great relationship. So, all right. Well, thank you for joining. Thank you, Cindy, Eileen, for you guys being there online. Well, next Wednesday, we'll come back to the family reconciliation of Joseph. God bless. We'll see you Sunday, 9:45 Bible study, 10:45 for worship, and 4 p.m. in the afternoon. And we'll see you